the inside story on the issues that affect you and your community. This is Local 12 Newsmakers.
Good morning and welcome to Local 12 Newsmakers. I'm Dan Hurley. Once again, the United States finds itself confronting the explosive issues that cluster around class disparity, race relations, and racism. Because of Thanksgiving, we are recording this program on Tuesday morning. Last night, the decision by a grand jury in Ferguson, Missouri, not to indict a police officer, Darren Wilson, in the August shooting of Michael Brown, turned boiling unrest into rioting in St. Louis and spurred demonstrations in major cities across the country. Against the backdrop of deep rates of disparity in infant mortality, childhood poverty, sexually transmitted diseases, and unemployment that follow lines of race, income, and neighborhood, are we Cincinnatians and Americans doomed to always be waiting for the next spark that will turn frustration into violence? That is the question posed recently in an open letter to the community by my guest this morning, Karen Bankston. Ms. Bankston is the Associate Dean of Clinical Practice, Partnership, and Community Engagement at the University of Cincinnati's College of Nursing. She is the former CEO at Drake Hospital. Karen, welcome back to Newsmakers.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, this was an interesting letter that was posted on WCPO.com.
Yes.
But it comes at a really incredible time. You and I talked probably 9-10 days ago.
Yes, that's right.
And here we are doing it the morning after
yes.
All of this has broken out. You know, you point out, and I alluded to, these differentials, these disparities, and infant mortality, childhood poverty, incidents of HIV and AIDS being tracked by neighborhood, by racial group, by income group. Are these disparities about race, or are they about income? And what's the intersection?
Well, and that was the whole reason for my writing that particular op-ed, because I think that there is an intersection. My concern and the outrage that was within my heart is that even though I've been involved, and many have been involved in doing lots of great work to address these initiatives, the gap continues along racial lines. And so the question for all of us ought to be, why is that? What's going on, and what are we missing that we're not seeing where the dots are connected? We're not seeing where the intersections are at, because if we were, those disparity gaps would not be widening, they'd be closing.
Well, especially in the case, I know, of infant mortality and childhood poverty. These are peculiarly bad.
Yes.
This is peculiarly bad data about Cincinnati.
Yes.
It's not just that we're sort of at the norm for urban America.
That's correct.
We're in a particularly bad situation
That's
on
right.
these two, and we've done shows about the reports that have done that. What's your sense of why that is?
Well, you know, part of it, I think we've gotten ourselves in a downward spiral, if I can use that analogy, because everything is connected, and I think that in many respects we've looked at things pretty linear and perhaps addressed things what we call in the healthcare industry episodically, as opposed to looking at it from a systemic perspective. Certainly people talk about institutional and systemic racism. We talk about racialized outcomes, but does everyone really understand what that means from a systems perspective? So where do you start in the cycle? Do you start with the notion that people are not, we as African Americans are not in a position to get the type of education that we require in order to be successful? Does the education we know helps us to get the kinds of jobs that we need, that helps us to not be in poverty, that helps us to get the jobs that we need, that will help us then to have healthy lives? Then if we get pregnant, our babies will be okay and they'll grow up and the cycle continues, right? So do we start there, or do we start with the children? You know, where do we start? And I know that, you know, as a community, we're kind of doing all of those things. We're working in bits and pieces with all of those things, but how well are we really understanding where they're connected, and how well do we understand the historical perspectives that perhaps are compounding our problem? You might say, well, what do you mean by that? Specifically, if indeed you have always been in a certain community, or if you've only been on a certain street and you've never, ever, ever seen anything except that, then you begin in your life, in your world, your worldview is that's the norm. So the norm now is something very different than maybe what's on the street three streets away, okay? So that becomes the norm. And I think that for some people, what used to not be normal is now normal.
You have a sentence in your letter that reads, "When I was a teenager in the 1960s, our community, family, friends, neighbors were all focused on making better lives for one another. Heads of households who had not had the opportunity to go to school, let alone college, expected their children to exceed their academic achievements. College was necessary and critical right of responsibility. Somewhere along the way, we lost some of that." Now that's an interesting sentence to me, because it seems as I'm even older than you, as we've beaten down certain things that barred African Americans from getting in, you're saying that there's been a shift in the culture, and I think you're talking about the black culture here.
Yes. When I think about, and I'm a native of Youngstown, Ohio, and grew up with my grandparents in my maternal grandparents' home, and not too far from the steel mills where my grandfather worked for 45 years. He only went to the 3rd grade. My grandmother went to the 7th grade. They had in their minds that their children and subsequently their grandchildren were all going to go to college. Now, they didn't necessarily know what that meant, except to say that they knew that that meant we would do better. But when we were walking along the streets of Youngstown, Ohio, going from school to the park or whatever, every parent or grandparent sitting on the porch had a role to play in who we were as people. And it was okay for Mrs. Henderson next door to tell Karen, "You better not do that, I'm going to tell your mother." Versus today, we don't have that same sense of community. Now we have the "don't talk to my child," because that's my child. The other thing that, I don't know why that changed, that sense of community, I guess is where I'm getting at with that. I don't know what happened that we lost that sense of community. Well, did it change
in doing oral histories?
Yes.
I hear that same kind of story a lot of times. And on the one hand, it's because there were a mix of people in those segregated neighborhoods.
Yes.
They were segregated by race, but there were also people who had well-paying professional jobs, the doctors, the lawyers, the people who worked for the post office, all lived in the same community, and there was more variety. So actually allowing those communities people to move out and get other places, then all of a sudden you changed the nature of those inner city neighborhoods.
Well, that's exactly right, and because I've been thinking a lot about this as I'm constructing for myself what an action might be that I could participate in related to this, and that is this. To your point, you're absolutely correct. When we were segregated in these neighborhoods with the mix of people who were all African American, as African Americans moved into the middle class, then we moved into neighborhoods and integrated neighborhoods that were segregated with the majority population, all right? That also changed the schools. You know, I always tell people that I started school right after the Brown versus Board of Education, so at the beginning of the integration of the public school system. Well, what's happened now because of that movement, we're back to segregated schools. So what's happened in that time, because we had segregated schools before, students did well in segregated schools. We now have segregated schools again, but there are structures and processes and resources that are missing in these now new segregated schools, although we can't say that they're segregated schools because the law said that they're not segregated. They're not officially not segregated schools. So we can't say that, but what's happened is that because of these, what I call racialized outcomes, because of the changes in the economy, because of the changes in how the world has socialized ourselves, the way we've socialized ourselves as African Americans, we've created some of the very same kinds of environments and outcomes that we had back.
So much of this in your letter is actually a challenge. There's a challenge to a variety of people here, but it's a challenge to middle-class African Americans who have moved out, not only to reach out the hand, but also you're calling for people to talk about what that meant and talk about the experience.
Yes, see, I think, you know, it's interesting. When I moved to Cincinnati, and I think I may have shared this with you before, Dan, when I first came here 20 years ago, I was always introduced as the new African American administrator at University Hospital, and I was like, why do you keep saying that? I'm sure that everybody could tell that I'm African American. You don't have to say that. Not recognizing that that was a unique position for one to hold at that particular point in time. And I thought that, okay, so in some respects I'm going to be a pioneer. Okay, all right, I get that. But I've never been able to, for whatever reason, let go of the steps in the journey that got me to that point. And so for me, that passion that I have is because of that. I can't forget that. And even though I've accomplished a great amount, I'm asking my colleagues, my friends, what can we do together to answer these questions and help some of the most compassionate people in the country who are trying to resolve some of these issues to get the cycle broken.
You also say, though, that in a lot of the meetings that you end up in, boards that you happen to serve on, that the people who are the people want to reach out to, they want to solve some problems. They say they want to address things, but in those meetings, the people who are being talked about aren't inside the meetings.
That is absolutely correct. They're not only are they not in the meeting, the discussions related to the people that we're saying we're going to help, we don't just say it. You know, we don't say when we're looking at data related to maybe it's infant mortality, maybe it's fourth grade reading levels, maybe it's the rate of poverty. We don't say that we're talking about African American children and women or African American families. We don't say that. We just talk about it in the aggregate with the numbers, and that's not to minimize any other groups' issues, because you know other groups have issues as well. But what we know is that from an African American perspective in our region, the gap is larger. And I would like people to say that, and then we can begin to be culturally sensitive and have interventions that are culturally sensitive. And we cannot do that if there are not people in the room who look like the people that you're trying to help.
Well, there's also another dynamic which I loved in your article very early on. You talk about the culture of politeness in Cincinnati, which what I've always called Cincinnati polite. That we don't really confront each other when we're face to face. We just talk about it after we leave.
Yes, and we talk about it in our homes. You know, we might say, oh, that wasn't a just response. Or we might say, I am so sick of these people talking about this. You know, whatever we're saying in our homes, that happens. But when we're together and we're problem solving, we don't talk about it because we're trying to be politically correct. And everyone is concerned that, well, gosh, they're going to think I'm this or I'm that. Forget that. Let's talk about how can we help people. This, for me, is about the human spirit. This is about a group of people who have been marginalized for a long time. And I know that individuals will say to me, well, Karen, can we just get over that? I don't have anything to do with that. My family didn't have anything to do with that. And that all may very well be true. However, when we look at some of the unconscious policies, unconscious rules, the institutionalization of things that have occurred, there are these barriers and biases that still are occurring in our communities that have implications for individuals. And so subsequently what we have now are young people who do not know how to manage their anger, you know, to what we're seeing right now in Ferguson. People who, you know, even though the family has said, please do not be violent, let's work together on this. people don't know how to handle their emotions because these are things that have been building up over time.
And they just burst forth.
And they just burst forth.
I got less than a minute, but I want to finish with your final image in your letter. Finally, we need to get comfortable saying aloud to one another the things that we say in our homes. That action is not just. If not, I fear African Americans will travel the same path towards marginalization as the indigenous population of our great nation.
Yes.
That is a powerful way to end this, and I've only got about 15 seconds, but what do you want to say to that?
I just say that we can do this. We can do this. This is not a call to say, oh, woe is me. This is not woe is me. We can do this.
I encourage everybody to go to read this, even though it's on WCPO.com, and thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you.
After the break, a discussion about pending Ohio legislation designed to protect the opportunity for our children to continue to learn about the Holocaust and genocide, another cluster of tough issues that new school policies, inadvertently or intentionally, will eliminate from the curriculum. Welcome back. This morning we've been focusing on confronting and promoting the discussion of difficult issues. In the first half of the program, we focused on race relations in the United States and in Cincinnati. Another difficult but critical topic is the Holocaust and modern genocides. Right now, in the lame duck session of the Ohio legislature, the Ohio House of Representatives is considering the adoption of Senate Bill 96. SB 96, which has already passed the Senate, would guarantee that Ohio students study at least one semester of world history. It is only in world history or contemporary world issues, some, of course, similar to that a student would encounter these realities in our modern life. I am joined now by Sarah Weiss, the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Commission and the Center for Holocaust and Humanities Education, which I can never stop from giving a plug to because I think it's one of the best exhibits in this community. And it's not in any big museum, but it is an incredible exhibit, a moving exhibit. So Sarah, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
SB 96, lame duck session, we can talk about the implications of that in a moment. Why is this law necessary? Why do we need to legislate that students will preserve the commitment to world history?
Sure. So the reason that it's possible that world history will be eliminated starting in the next school year is because we are entering a new phase of the Ohio graduation tests. So it's changing from the current test to a new test in the coming year, and there are no questions, testing, assessment related to world history, world geography, contemporary issues, and therefore, if it's not tested, schools may elect to not teach it, not allocate resources to it, and so in order to ensure that it's taught, SB 96 will require that one course.
Pardon me, but the whole trend of not history but contemporary life is towards globalization and the shrinking of the human community across the globe. Why in the heck would we stop looking at these sorts of issues?
So that's a great question, and I don't think there's anybody who can really give a definitive answer of why this makes any sense. It is apparent that we need our students exposed to the global world, and you know, I'm not sure there's really anybody to point fingers at. I think the issue is really to get it resolved and ensure that it's taught.
Well, who are the sponsors?
Sure.
Who sort of is committed to SB 96 and preserving this? Anybody local?
Sure. So, so there are some significant supporters of this. So first of all, the sort of spearheading the advocacy for it is actually the Ohio Council on Social Studies, and we've joined the effort another number of organizations who are committed to ensuring that our students have global awareness. It was introduced to the Senate, the Ohio Senate, in the spring by Senator LaRose, Frank LaRose, actually from Northeast Ohio. He's been a staunch advocate for this. It now sits in the Ohio House of Representatives Education Committee, and and it's received positively. It's a bipartisan issue. It's supported by both Republicans and Democrats. One of our local representatives, Denise Driehaus, is certainly supportive of it and optimistic that it will pass, but we need to ensure that it's brought to the floor in the lame duck session.
Let's talk about the lame duck session, because people may not know the intricacies of this sort of thing.
Yeah.
So here's a bill that I'm not sure when it was dropped, when it was introduced, but it's worked its way through the Senate. It's now in the House. And in a lame duck session, if it doesn't pass, what happens?
So if it doesn't pass in this lame duck session, which we're not exactly sure how long will last, probably into December, but before
mid-December,
before everyone goes home for holidays, then it will have to start over, because we're going to have a new group of legislators in Columbus, and so we'll have to start from square one. So if it doesn't pass in this lame duck session, it will have to not only be reintroduced, but it will probably not even be brought to the floor in time for anything to be done for to ensure next year world history is taught. It will take probably...
Because the calendars will be out of sync. The legislative and the school calendars will be out of sync.
Exactly.
Is this related at all to discussions around Common Core?
So that's a common question. However, it's separate from Common Core. Common Core is really focused on reading, critical thinking skills, math skills, not really related to social studies. It's really more related to the change in the Ohio graduation testing.
As a longtime social studies teacher, I would like to back up on that and say critical thinking skills are related to social studies and history. But go ahead.
Right. You're right. And reading primary resources and analyzing those resources and analyzing the media, all part of Common Core. But really, the issue is separate from Common Core, and we want to ensure people that just not to get it mixed up. It's really a separate issue altogether.
So it's just a question of the changing of the test, and this is a classic example of test driving curriculum rather than tests reflecting curriculum.
Yes.
Where what's primary and what's secondary has gotten turned on its head.
Right. And we hear that from many educators, but this is the reality, and so as we...
You're particularly concerned, I mean, and I started out by saying globalization is absolute, it's a fundamental reality of ongoing society. But you're particularly interested in this because these are the only places that issues around the Holocaust and genocide will ever get taken up. And talk to me a little bit about why you think that's important.
So, you know, as you may know, this summer there was erected on the State House lawn memorial commemorating not only the Holocaust but also World War II and our involvement in World War II and the liberators that live right here in Ohio. And so as we think about that one issue, the Holocaust, World War II, its impact on Ohio, it's critical that this be taught to our students, and it is the only place where it's directly in the standards, in the state of Ohio standards, and so we want to ensure this is taught. But although we feel particularly concerned about Holocaust and genocide education, the Armenian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, all of these other atrocities that we need to ensure we learn from, so that we really think about what's going on in the world and speak up when we see similar things happening. Aside from that, we understand that it's so critical, regardless of just related to the Holocaust, of our young people having an understanding of the world, because everything impacts us here locally that's going on around the world. And so, yes, we care on a personal level about ensuring the Holocaust be taught, but on a more global level, we just need to ensure our students know about the world and understand a little bit beyond our own community and world.
You know, it's if this was something that was just in the past, it happened during World War II and it's over, but you mentioned Rwanda, you mentioned the Armenian, there are other issues. The issue of genocide as it plays out in other parts of the world, the Middle East right now,
Right.
this ends up on the front page of the paper.
Right.
It's a word that we use,
Right.
we talk about, we throw it around. If we don't know what it means,
Right.
it really becomes a problem.
Right.
So what do you want people to do?
I would just encourage people to look at the Ohio House of Representatives Education Committee, and if there are members that you have relationships with, please encourage them to support SB 96 and bringing it to the House floor in this lame duck session. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you for making Newsmakers a part of your Sunday morning. Join us again next week to meet the men and the women working to shape our community for a better future. Have a good week.
Thank you.